Now the second plugin I'd like to look at today is the very recently introduced VSS3 source specific early reflective reverb. Now this again is another algorithm which has been taken from TC's high-end System 6000. It can also be found in the high-end M4000 reverb unit as well. Now what sets the VSS3 apart from most of the current crop of reverbs that are out there is that it isn't a convolution reverb. We've all become very used to using the convolution reverbs, whether it's part of our DAW package or some of the other third-party ones that are available, and they're really great for realistic spaces, but quite often they don't allow you the control you need to really tailor the reverb for the track that you're doing, and you kind of end up just trawling through loads of presets to find the nearest one that fits to what you're doing. Now the great thing about the VSS3 is it allows you to tailor every aspect of the sound. You can choose the early reflections part of the sound independently from the reverb type, and you can also change all the crossover points for the decay of the reverb and all the other parameters in between. So what we'll do now is we'll have a closer look at the VSS3 and you'll really be able to see for yourself what an exciting tool it is in the studio. Okay, now what you can see now is the main screenshot of the VSS3 reverb. Again, it looks very similar to the MD3 and brick wall package. As I said, it is a direct port from the System 6000, and this is what it would look like on a System 6000. Now basically the main screen you can see here is the first screen. You get to choose the amount of decay, the reverb delay, the high cut, the pre-delay and the high decay, as well as a level section at the bottom here where you can adjust the level between the dry signal, the early reflection signal and the reverb signal. So very simply I can take the early reflections totally out here and the dry signal, just leave the reverb, or I can bring the early reflections right up, take the reverb right out, just hear the early reflections, or I can have the dry signal and nothing else. Now the second page on the VSS3 is the early reflections page. As I mentioned earlier, the great thing about the VSS3 is the amount of control you've got between all the different elements. Okay, this is the early reflections page of the VSS3, and I've currently got the church algorithm selected as my early reflections. Now if you look across to the right hand side of the screen, you'll see the early reflections position. Now it's greyed out and says fixed position. A number of parameters on the VSS3 are twinned, so in this case when you choose church as your early reflections algorithm, the early reflections position is fixed. You don't have to fiddle with that, and that's true for a lot of the parameters within the VSS3. Now here we are on the reverb page of the VSS3. This is where you set your reverb type and all the parameters associated with it, such as the low cut, the high cut, the stereo width, the low damp and the high soften. And at the bottom of the page is a very important part of the VSS3, which is the decay crossover section. Now it's here that you can really sculpt the reverb to fit into your track. So you can choose the crossover points of the low decay, the low mid decay, the high mid decay and the high decay, and you can also choose the decay length for those individual bands. So say for instance we want to take out the low end and leave the reverb quite fizzy, we can just pull out the low decay, as you can hear there, and just leave the high end going. Alternatively we could do it the other way round, put the low decay back on and move the high decay down to 0, which leaves you with a very mellow kind of reverb, very warm. Now for me this is one of the greatest things of the VSS3 because it really allows you to get the reverb to sit in your track as you want it, without having to resort to putting an EQ after the reverb and all that type of thing, which is only a quick fix. It doesn't actually allow you, like the VSS3 does, to change the reverb decay for each individual band. Okay, we're now moving on to the last page of the VSS3, and that's the modulation section. Now a lot of the early reverbs from the 80s, artificial reverbs from certain manufacturers, used modulation as a way of creating a denser reverb with a kind of warm shimmering tail, and the reverb modulation section on the VSS3 allows you to do that. Again, you get to choose from the reverb mod type you want, the rate that you want it to be going at, and the width you want it to be going at. Now the second part of the modulation page is the space modulation section, and this allows for modulations which have a much greater stereo width, but still retain stereo compatibility. And in this section you can choose the space mod type. In this case we're using slow. You can choose the space mod rate, the space mod width, and the space mod depth. The modulation section is a great way to add a real shimmer and depth to your reverb, and it's not available on obviously the current copper convolution reverbs, and it's a really welcome addition to the VSS3 source specific early reflective reverb.